Our session to order. Welcome to the 49th meeting of the Standing Committee on Industry and Technology of the House of Commons. Pursuant to our order, we are now studying Bill C-244, an act to amend the Copyright Act, diagnosis, maintenance, and repair. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022.
Act to amend the Criminal Code and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, trafficking in human organs, standing in the name of Mr. Jennings.
There being no motion at report stage, the House will now proceed without debate to the putting of the question on the motion to concur in the bill at report stage. Mr. Jennings, seconded by Monsieur Juveri, moves that Bill S-223, an act to amend the Criminal Code and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, trafficking in human organs, be concurred in at report stage. If a member of a recognized party present in the House wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think there'll be agreement for the motion to be carried unanimously.
Agreed? Agreed. I therefore declare the motion carried. Okay, when shall I read the bill a third time? Now? Now. Always wanted to say that. Now. Mr. Jennings, seconded by Monsieur Zuberi, moves that Bill S-223, an act to amend the Criminal Code and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, trafficking in human organs, be now read a third time and do pass. Debate. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. Before he starts, I just want to remind all the members who are having discussions in the room who are close to the member who's about to speak that he's about to speak, just so that we can all hear what he's saying. The honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am very pleased to be speaking today on Bill S-223, the next and hopefully the last in a long line of bills that have been proposed here and in the other place to begin the fight against the horrific practice of forced organ harvesting and trafficking. I want to thank the member for Pierre Fondal for seconding the bill, recognize the incredible work done by Senator Toulajan as well, who proposed this bill, and I had the honor of carrying that work on in this place. Now, this bill would make it a criminal offense for a person to go abroad and receive an organ taken without consent. S-223 also creates a mechanism by which a person could be deemed inadmissible to Canada for involvement in forced organ harvesting and trafficking. This bill recognizes a basic moral principle that killing people or exploiting them for their organs is wrong everywhere and should be stopped everywhere. Efforts to combat this practice have been ongoing in Canada's Parliament for close to 15 years, and the time that has elapsed underlines the sad reality of how long it takes to pass good private members' bills, even when everyone agrees. But S-223 has now made it further than any of its predecessors. Having passed the Senate and now been reported back from committee without amendments, this bill only needs to complete this third reading stage and receive royal assent before becoming law. Thanks to the member for Bow River trading with me today and the member for Simcoe North trading the second hour slot for me on Wednesday, this bill will complete debate this week and should pass its final vote in time for Christmas. In the past, I have always given uncharacteristically short speeches on this bill, trying to engineer an early collapse to debate in order to move the bill along more quickly. However, given that we now have the security of a second hour for debate lined up and a tight timeline to move forward in any event, I will use the opportunity to now, for the first time, lay out my views on this subject in a level of detail that the full time allows. Now, this bill responds to one particularly egregious human rights violation, but it also takes an important step towards the embrace of a vital principle of human rights more broadly. That is, the idea of the universality of human rights and of the responsibility of nations to prudentially use the means at their disposal to protect fundamental human rights, not only within their own nations, but for every human being in every corner of the globe. S-223 applies criminal prohibitions against organ harvesting and trafficking beyond Canada's borders. It recognizes that organ harvesting and trafficking is not just wrong in Canada as a result of particularly Canadian values or a particularly Canadian social contract. Rather, it recognizes that organ harvesting and trafficking is wrong because it denies the universal principle of inherent human dignity and value, a principle that should be understood and applied universally. In this sense, it seeks to continue the process of innovation around the principle of national sovereignty that began in 1948 with the promulgation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Today, I'd like to make the case for the importance of embracing this continuing process of innovation, though with appropriate balance and with necessary parameters. Now, the principle of national sovereignty comes most sharply from the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 30 years of war in the Holy Roman Empire in 1648. National sovereignty emerged as a necessary practical compromise from the new reality created by the Protestant Reformation. Prior to the Reformation, Western Europe had a kind of moral and religious unity, with the Pope as spiritual leader and the Emperor as a temporal ruler, whose practical jurisdiction varied from place to place, but who expressed a kind of civilizational unity of the Western Christian world. The Reformation ended that unity and led to generations of wars, with most of the Catholic powers struggling to restore that civilizational unity, and with the Protestant powers, with the periodic help of France, seeking to break the power of the Pope and Emperor and create a reality in which nation states could be their own authority in most areas. The Peace of Westphalia, more from exhaustion than decisive victory, marked the end of this period of religious wars and the beginning of the period of nation states. Notably, this wasn't the beginning of some great flowering of individual freedom, liberty, and human rights. The division of Europe into blocs meant that Catholics were persecuted in Protestant nations just as Protestants were persecuted in Catholic nations, and later as Catholics were brutally persecuted in anti-religious revolutionary France. Westphalia was not about saying that individuals could believe and do what they liked. It was Caius Regio, Ius Religio. The religion of the ruler shall be the religion of the state. Under these circumstances, religious persecution continued for hundreds of years, and nations, though less inclined to fight wars over religion, fought wars that reflected the aspirations of rulers, no longer checked or mediated by supernatural structures that reflected civilizational unity. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the rise of new universalist movements. The French Revolution and later Marxism were a great threat to existing structures and ideas of national sovereignty because they made universal claims about the kinds of power structures that should exist, instead of accepting the Westphalian idea that it was up to the local political authorities to decide how a place would be governed. These movements were obviously different, but a common thread can be discerned in the thinking of political universalists of both the pre-Reformation and the revolutionary type. They believe that insofar as there is such a thing as truth, insofar as there is such a thing as human nature, and insofar as there is a resulting right and wrong way for a people to be governed, efforts should be made to apply these principles universally. Now, there is intuitive logic to the idea that truth and justice for human beings in one place should be the same as truth and justice for human beings in another place. There are more modern arguments made for the rejection of this kind of moral universalism that propose the general subjectivity of truth. I will comment more on these arguments later. For the time being, we should note that the emergence of national sovereignty as a principle in European politics did not arise from the rejection of absolute truth in religious and political matters. It rather arose from the practical recognition that such universals could not be practically enforced through warfare, at least not at any acceptable cost. The idea of national sovereignty was seen as a necessary political compromise to preserve some measure of peace and security. It is hard to say how well national sovereignty actually worked at achieving its objectives. One can never test counterfactuals, but we can never know what would have happened in Europe if this particular piece of political technology had not been invented. Certainly, Europeans kept fighting wars of various kinds after 1648, but the return of the broadest and most devastating European wars tended to align with the emergence of new universalist ideologies. Now, following the last of these total European wars, nations came together to try to shape a new kind of settlement. This included the formation of the United Nations in 1945 and also the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights exactly 300 years after the signing of the Peace of Westphalia. Many of history's human rights declarations, especially prior to 1948, were calls to arms or efforts to justify violent revolution. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was radical insofar as it asserted the universality of various fundamental human rights, but it was also conservative in the sense that it was the project of nation states within a framework that still recognized national sovereignty, did not legally bind the state signatories to actually uphold the rights therein, and of course did not contain a call to arms to armed enforcement by the people. So this provided a somewhat contradictory foundation, and international human rights law has continued to evolve and grow since 1948 on that foundation that recognizes both national sovereignty and universal human rights as being of great importance. Now, notwithstanding the evident tension between these concepts, international diplomacy and law today recognizes that we cannot and ought not to dispense with either. An absence of recognition of national sovereignty would lead to perpetual conflict between nations representing irreconcilable philosophical systems. This was the background prior to the Peace of Westphalia, and a reality intermittently renewed by the rise of universalist, revolutionary, and totalitarian movements. But the absence of any national sovereignty, any limits on national sovereignty aimed at protecting universal human rights, would create a reality in which we look the other way when nations commit the most dastardly crimes towards their own people. Any moral person who believes in justice and universal human dignity must, at a certain point, refuse to consent to allowing certain evils to be committed in the name of national sovereignty. Even if the only consideration is national sovereignty, history shows us clearly that nations which show capricious disregard for the rights of their own people quickly become a menace to their neighbors. Recognizing the necessary tension between national sovereignty and international human rights, the approach of many nations has sadly been to talk the talk of international human rights, but not to put in practice meaningful mechanisms to enforce such rights. And the clearest example of this approach is the approach taken to the crime of genocide. Canada is a party to an international convention which seeks to define and make illegal the crime of genocide, regardless of assertions of national sovereignty. I strongly support this idea in principle and in practice. Slaughtering a group of people in an attempt to eradicate them is a horrific denial of universal human dignity, of the universal dignity of the person, and we should do what we can to prevent it. But unfortunately, while assenting to the idea in principle that genocide should be an international crime, the government of Canada has been reluctant to actually recognize any acts of genocide while they are in progress. They claim that their obligation to act in response to genocide is triggered by a determination by some undefined competent international authority, even if such authorities are easily manipulated by the state committing genocide. And additionally, this line from the government is fundamentally out of step with our actual legal obligations under the Genocide Convention. Our obligations as a signatory to the convention are to uphold that convention, which includes our responsibility to protect victims of genocide, regardless of national sovereignty and regardless of determinations by UN bodies. This is the legal obligation that we have assumed. Yet I also acknowledge the reality that it is not prudential to send in our troops in every case where genocide is happening. But rather than burying our heads in the sand and denying the existence of a genocide, the government should seek to clearly define the nature and also the limitations of how we would operationalize a responsibility to protect. Now, in my view, we need to develop real tools for practically integrating a commitment to universal human rights with a commitment to some form of national sovereignty. If an individual is involved in a violation of international human rights, and if the nation state in which the person lives elects not to punish them or even to condone their actions, then national sovereignty limits our ability to punish this criminal. But without resorting to means that are imprudent and likely to lead to even greater violence, we should still seek ways to punish those involved in human rights violations beyond our borders and thus deter criminals from committing these crimes. So enter Bill S-223, a little bill with a big idea. The idea that we should use the means that are reasonably at our disposal to punish violations of fundamental human rights that happen beyond our borders. We can do this by punishing Canadians who are complicit in these acts of violence and by shunning foreigners who are involved in such violence. In light of the emergent reality of global connectivity, these kinds of limited tools are still meaningful and begin the process of deterring crime that happens beyond our borders. It is a good thing that, if we agree it is always and everywhere wrong to do such and such a thing to a human being, then we would try to come up with some mechanism of accountability for these crimes that is prudent and that does not return to the kind of world that existed between the Protestant Reformation and the Peace of Westphalia. Now, this idea of actively applying international human rights principles extraterritorially is about us doing what we can under the circumstances to advance justice. A commitment to this principle is why I have worked hard to move this bill forward, and also why I support similar legislative mechanisms, such as the increasing use of Magnitsky sanctions, the adoption of Bill C-281, the International Human Rights Act, and the adoption of Bill S-211. I support these legislative efforts to promote justice beyond our borders, because my children here in Canada are no more or less human than Uyghur children, than Rohingya children, than the young nephew of my assistant who faces a hard winter in Ukraine, or than Kian Pirfalak, a 9-year-old boy who was murdered by police while attending a pro-freedom protest in Iran. Now, Madam Speaker, in conclusion, I want to return to a question I raised earlier, the case for universal moral claims in a world made up of diverse cultures and political traditions. Every society since the dawn of time has tried to regulate itself with doctrines of something like morality. It is impossible for people to live together in community if they do not regulate their interactions in some way. Further, it is our nature as beings to try to live rationally, to try to explain the decisions we make with reference to some good or goods. But while there has never been a society without some kind of moral doctrines, and while those moral doctrines have sought to protect the lives and security of certain individuals, most societies have excluded certain groups or individuals from that protection. They have sought to protect an in-group without protecting an out-group, seeking to narrow the definition of what it is to be human and perhaps allowing the exploitation of the out-group for some advantage. The core of my political philosophy is a simple commitment to universal humanism. That is, to the idea that we should not think in terms of in-group and out-group when making decisions about fundamental human rights. If we are to speak authentically about human rights, then these are rights for all humans, regardless of age, environment, citizenship, skin color, or any other factor. Throughout history and still today, there are many who seek to limit the human family for their own convenience, but I believe that a person is a person. Now, naturally, there are certain kinds of rights that do flow from exchange. A worker has a right to wages. That is a right particular to a worker. A citizen has certain rights that accord with the obligations that they have taken on to the nation in which they live. But when we speak of human rights, these are rights that do not exist because of exchange. Rather, they are rights that flow from the universal nature of the human person. Ideas of rights and justice are philosophical propositions that cannot be proven scientifically. All doctrines of human rights have their roots in something like faith, in the embrace of propositions that are not scientifically verifiable. But the idea of universal human rights flowing from a universal humanness can be supported by observing how it accords with the universal aspirations of all people. Today, as we speak, the people of China and the people of Iran are taking to the streets, bravely demanding change. And as we speak, incredibly, both of these totalitarian governments are at least feigning in the direction of concession. And the people of Ukraine have and continue to heroically resist Putin's invasion, even as more and more Russians bravely express their own discontent. I am proudly here today endorsing this universal movement for freedom and justice, to say that a person is a person no matter where they live, and to say that we can and should prudentially work to affirm and give greater meaning to the idea of universal human rights. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds.
Thank you. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to ask the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. We worked together on the Uyghur case, and we are co-chairs of a group together.
Impact that grave and serious human rights concern, which this House has said is genocide that is occurring currently to the Uyghur people. How does he see this ameliorating that particular situation right now?
Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We've seen many initiatives before this House, including my friend's Motion 62, and these initiatives deal with different parts of the conflict, of the genocide. Recognition, sanctions, immigration measures, forced labor. There are many different pieces to it that require a response. This bill seeks to combat forced organ harvesting and trafficking, and certainly we've been hearing more and more reports, that Uyghurs have been victims of forced organ harvesting and trafficking as well. And this bill, by cutting off some of the demand for those organs and by seeking to in some sense, punish those involved in forced organ harvesting and trafficking, it is an important step. There's still many more steps that are required, but it is an important step to trying to advance justice for Uyghurs.
Questions and
Comments. The Honourable Member for Cowichan, Malahat Langford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for shepherding this bill to this stage. It's been a long journey. Maybe a question based on the earlier intervention, aside from what's happening with the Uyghur population, over the many years that the member has been involved in trying to shepherd this bill through the Parliament of Canada, can you inform the House of what the trends and statistics have been like worldwide, which underline a strong case and necessity for this bill being passed into law at this moment in time? Thank you.
Honourable Member for Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for the question. There are different kinds of cases of forced organ harvesting and trafficking. We often speak of the situation in China where forced organ harvesting and trafficking is part of the persecution of dissidents or minorities. Falun Gong practitioners have been significantly targeted for decades. Now we're seeing increasing targeting of Uyghurs as part of a state-directed and controlled system. But there are many other countries around the world where forced organ harvesting and trafficking happens, not likely coordinated by the state, but in kind of the dark, ungoverned or less governed corners of society, where people that are poor and vulnerable are taken advantage of and coerced or compelled into giving up their organs. So we know this is a problem. It can be, there have been various efforts to quantify it. It's a difficult thing to quantify. It's particularly difficult to quantify the extent to which Canadians are or aren't complicit in this. But this bill takes an important step in responding to that reality throughout the world.
Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, for his dissertation. It was well researched and well articulated. I would just say, in addition to the Falun Gong practitioners, we know that they have been unfairly and unjustly targeted by the regime in Beijing for organ harvesting. They are denied freedom of religion, denied their freedom of association, freedom of expression, and things that we take for granted here in Canada. And we know that our former colleague, David Kilgore, as well as James Mattis, wrote a large study and briefing document on those that were responsible for the organ harvesting of the Falun Dafa in China. And they brought forward, along with Falun Gong practitioners here in Canada, over 20 names of those that have profited from this very gross, and I mean gross in every means possible, human rights violations of Falun Gong practitioners in China, of having their organs harvested because of their, as political dissidents. None of them have ever been sanctioned. Can the member talk to that fact, that will this bill actually allow us to make sure that, one, nobody in Canada profits or gains access to these illicit organs, and two, is why aren't we sanctioning those individuals that are responsible?
Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, 20 seconds.
Madam Speaker, this bill does create a mechanism by which those involved in forced organ harvesting and trafficking would be inadmissible to Canada. In terms of broader sanctions, Magnitsky-style sanctions, I think it's important that we also pass Bill C-281, which creates a mechanism by which through which a parliamentary committee could recommend people for Magnitsky sanctions. That would help us move forward as well to get more people involved in these kinds of human rights violations onto the sanctions list.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Donner.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'aimerais avant
Thank you very much.
le membre de Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan,
I'd like to start by thanking the member for Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan,
who has introduced this, created this conversation within our House, the lower house, the House of Commons, on this Senate Bill S-223, an act to amend the Criminal Code and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, trafficking in human organs. This is a critical piece of legislation. This piece of legislation will help us address a grave and serious human rights concern. This piece of legislation is new and adds to an existing body that already does address criminality, but doesn't address it with respect to organ harvesting outside of Canada or outside of our territory. I want to acknowledge our collective commitment to ensuring that these important reforms become law, the commitment of all members of this House, from what I can see. And the important thing, the beautiful thing about this legislation, or us discussing this legislation, is that we are focused on the public good. we are focused on the public good, putting aside our partisan squabbles to promote what is right and just. D'abord, j'aimerais rappeler l'historique des
I'd like to start by looking at the various legislative measures proposed here. Before 2023, 2020, and 2017, two bills have proposed identical reforms. I'm talking about former bills S-204 and Bill S-240. There were also two private members' bills from 2017 and 2013. They also proposed similar reforms. Bills C-350 and 361
legislation. Nous sommes tous d'accord pour dire que le
We all agree that organ trafficking is an odious crime.
So as I said earlier, this piece of legislation creates something new within the criminal code that speaks specifically to the trafficking of organs, extraterritorially, I gotta get that word correct, outside of the territory of Canada. Additionally, it amends the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act so that those who are seeking to reside permanently in Canada and or foreign nationals will be inadmissible. That's inadmissible to our beautiful country for engaging in conduct that constitutes one of the offenses that's proposed in this legislation. These offenses target anybody who obtains organs or who participates in or facilitates in the trafficking of organs for persons who do not provide informed consent. This legislation also seeks to target those who obtained organs that are purchased and those who participate or facilitate in the transfer of purchased organs. These are coercive practices. They are difficult to prove, but they send a clear and strong signal that we as a country do not accept this. We know, unfortunately, that people who are wealthier unwittingly or sometimes wittingly engage in this practice. Those who are victims of this practice are almost always deeply vulnerable. The transplant of organs without consent is abhorrent. Oftentimes, this leads to devastating impacts on those who have had their organs trafficked. They're uncompensated, they live with lifelong problems, they sometimes die. The member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, and I participated in an important study around the Uyghur people. This was over 2 years ago at a subcommittee of our parliamentary subcommittee of international human rights. We heard testimony from a survivor of the concentration camps within Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And he accounted to us how, in testimony, how he was apprehended, was asked to sign a forced confession, refused to do so, how he was medically examined to such an extent that he thought that he would have been dissected on that table, that his eyes were going to be removed or his organs were going to be harvested on the spot during examination. This piece of legislation seeks to target any behavior that removes organs from people, that harvests organs from people. I recognize that the criminal code may apply currently to some of the conduct that this bill is seeking to legislate on. Right now, the criminal code has assault offenses, which apply to when organs are harvested here in Canada with coercion. This piece of legislation, as I mentioned earlier, applies outside of Canada. also looks at what happens outside of Canada. Right now, there's no international covenant from the UN which speaks specifically to organ harvesting in its essence as the main thrust of a covenant. But there are two covenants that do touch upon organ harvesting. First, and Canada is party to both of these instruments, these UN instruments. First is the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. This supplements the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. We also, this was ratified on May 13, 2002. After this first piece of international law comes the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Children on the Sale of Children, Child Prostitution, and Child Pornography. This protocol addresses offering and delivering and accepting of a child for the purposes of transferring children's organs, in particular Article 3. This was ratified on September 14, 2005. In 2014, the Council of Europe's Convention Against the Trafficking in Human Organs also speaks directly to organ harvesting. I'll conclude by recognizing the important work that has been done around this, in particular, David Kilgore and David Mateus, both of whom have done extensive research around Falun Gong, Falun Dafa practitioners, both of whom have dedicated years to highlighting this particular issue around organ harvesting. We know that David Kilgore served in this House for many years and served both the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. He was a person of conviction. He was a person who continued to remain active after serving this House. He was somebody that I crossed paths with before entering this House. And I remember this gentleman as a sincere person who was advocating for the public good and for human rights. It's important to mark also David Mateus, who along with David Kilgore conducted extensive research and allowed us to build a body of evidence that proved not only anecdotally, but empirically that this is an abhorrent phenomenon that is occurring right now. Fast forward to the present. We in the Subcommittee of International Human Rights, we heard how this is currently happening towards the Uyghur people. We heard within the airports in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, in Urumqi, if my memory serves me correctly, there were lines on the floor as you enter the airport, specifically demarcating that one can pick up organs. This is abhorrent. This type of practice must stop. This practice might exist currently within a region of the world that we know, but this legislation applies across the board. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Prise du débat, l'honorable député d'Avignon-la-Métis.
The honorable member for Avignon-la-Métis-Matane, Matapédia. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm always very pleased to rise in this House. Today, I rise to speak about Bill S-223. It's always wonderful when there's consensus in this House. It's always nice to see that the different parties can agree on an issue, and so I'm very pleased to rise here. I think this is real progress for Quebecers and Canadians, and I'm very pleased about it. We know that organ trafficking is a barbarous practice which has existed for some time and which became more widespread with the appearance of the internet and with immune suppressing drugs. I believe that we have a duty to legislate, but up until now there hasn't been any Canadian law to forbid Canadians from going abroad to receive organs, to buy organs and have them. we need this legislation to do something about social and economic inequality that exists all over the planet. And we also need to do this to fight organized crime. This bill is a step in the right direction when it comes to fighting organ trafficking. But its impact will only be proportional to the efforts made to raise awareness about the issue. And we also need to do more for people who are waiting for organs. Now, I'd like to just come back to some of the background. We know that this bill S-223 clearly lays out that it would be an offense to go abroad to receive an organ that has been removed without free and informed consent. So it would prevent people from doing abroad something that is forbidden in Canada, because the criminal code has exploiting people for their organs or tissues as an offense. So this is an additional tool. In Section 7 of the Criminal Code, this bill would amend the code in order to ensure that if someone does this type of thing abroad, they would be considered to be, they would be deemed to be committing an offense in Canada. So that means that if someone engaged in this behavior, or for a third party, knowing that the organ removal was done without the free and informed consent of the person the organ was taken from, this would be an offense, as well as facilitating such actions, again, without free and informed consent from the person whose organ it was, or someone legally authorized to consent on their behalf. Or if the person who's taking the organ doesn't care as to whether the consent was given. And any kind of involvement in this type of activity would also be considered an offense under this bill. The bill would also ensure that an immigrant cannot become a Canadian citizen if they are found guilty of such an offense. I think that's an important addition to the Immigration Act. There are many good reasons to vote in favor of this bill, as several colleagues have already mentioned. We know that Canada signed the Protocol Against Organized Transnational Crime, which is a UN convention to prevent and punish human trafficking, especially of women and children. It's better known under the name of the Palermo Protocol. The protocol makes human trafficking an offense, and that includes organ trafficking. The 2008 Istanbul Declaration also invites nations to take measures to fight weapons trafficking and transplant tourism. Canada also adheres to the 11 principles of the WHO on transplants, which forbids all payment for organ donations, as well as requiring free and informed consent from the donor, and states that minors must be protected and that the distribution of organs must be done in a fair and equitable manner. So we have committed to fight organs trafficking. And that's exactly what we see in this bill, in Bill S-223. We know that unfortunately, there are many more people who need a new organ in this world than organs available. And just like in any market where it's possible to make money because there's much more demand than supply, you can turn to the black market to obtain an organ. When someone's life is in danger, their desire to survive may overwhelm their sense of morals. And the following facts may describe the hidden face of organs trafficking. It's some things that were mentioned in the media in the last several years. According to the UN Organization to Fight Human Trafficking, there are 3 groups of people involved in organs trafficking: traffickers, who may force people to donate an organ, then people who sell the organs because they're in a financially precarious situation and sometimes receive very little money in return, despite the promises made. And then there's victims who are told that they must undergo an operation, after which an organ is removed against their will. This is a matter of organized crime, with many offenders, recruiters, transporters, hospital or clinic personnel, health professionals who carry out the surgery, intermediaries, buyers, organ banks. There are many actors involved. According to the UN initiative, it's very hard to see what's really happening in the depths of this underworld. According to a resolution of the World Health Assembly from 2004, member states should take measures to protect vulnerable groups against transplant tourism. Transplant tourism is the most common method for this type of international organ trade. People go abroad to get an organ transplanted, and some websites offer a one-stop shop where, for example, getting a kidney abroad may cost from $70,000 to $160,000.
C'est effectué au moyen d'un organe humain issu.
1 in 10 transplants is performed using a trafficked organ, or about 10,000 a year. Although kidneys are the most commonly sold organs, there's also illegal trafficking in hearts, livers, lungs, pancreases, corneases, and other human tissue. In a recent report, the Global Financial Integrity states that organ trafficking is on the rise in many countries, with annual profits of 600 to 1.2 billion. In Iran, the only country where organ trading is legal, organ sales are closely monitored, and the practice has eliminated the waiting list for kidney transplants and increased post-mortem organ donations, which are unpaid. According to a study at Harvard University, donors come from some of the poorest countries in South America, Asia, and Africa, while recipients often come from countries such as Canada, the United States, Australia, the UK, Israel, and Japan. According to research conducted at Michigan State University into the black market for human organs in Bangladesh, the average price of a kidney was $1,400 US, but this price has fallen due to abundant supply. Madam Speaker, I'll conclude. I could go on, but just over a week ago, Radio Canada's Enquête painted a picture of the failings of our health system when it comes to organ donation. According to Dr. Pierre Marcellet, we were a leader just 20 years ago, but now it's like we're just treading water. Instead of looking to poor people to do our organ transplants, let's aim to become leaders again. Until then, what might be interesting or a good gesture of support, and this is how it works in Quebec. I'm not sure how it works for other provinces, but in Quebec, as you know, Madam Speaker, you can sign the back of your health insurance card to consent to the donation of organs and tissue. It can also be done by registering on the Quebec Health Care System's website. That can save up to 8 lives and help 20 other people recover some of their health. So that's a very positive gesture for the future. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cowichan, Malahat Langford.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.